The next lesson in this unit is going to focus on agriculture and meat production. We've already considered how agriculture has a big effect on our water usage, with 70% of our global water resources being allocated for it. In this lecture, we'll take a look at the development of agriculture. We'll take a look at the environmental impact of fertilizers and pesticides, and then take a look at alternatives to conventional agriculture that might be more sustainable. Then we'll take a closer look at meat consumption and the benefits and drawbacks of producing meat, as well as a more sustainable approach. Let's begin with development of agriculture, and an interesting figure or person in this in the history of agriculture is Thomas Malthus. And the Malthusian theory or hypothesis was that population growth would eventually overmatch or outproduce our ability to provide food. And so his theory is based on the assumption that production of food would be linear because of the available land to grow food on. And so the idea was that if human population continues to grow exponentially, we'll eventually have a point where the population will outgrow the ability to provide food for it. And this was known as the Malthusian catastrophe. Well, so far, his hypothesis has not been supported by what happened. And a lot of that has to do with the development of agriculture, and we're going to talk about that in just a moment. Let's take a look at the major types of agriculture. Subsistence agriculture is basically to grow enough food for a family or a local population. There's not much trade or surplus produce. So this is very common in less developed countries. We see one type of subsistence agriculture is what we call shifting agriculture, most commonly referred to as slash and burn, where basically in areas where we have rainforests, a patch of the forest is cleared so that there's arable farmland, and crops will be grown on that area where the trees were cleared. The burning of the trees, of course, produces some nutrients that go into the soil. But the concern with this is that the soils in rainforests are very low in nutrients that plants require. And the reason for this is because there's no point in a rainforest where the leaves fall, like in a temperate rainforest. So a lot of the nutrients stay in the tree canopy. They never make it to the soil. And so when we burn down these trees and expose the soil to grow crops, the soil is not the best for growing fast-growing crops like vegetables and things. So this area of forest that has been burned down for growing crops, the soil may only be able to produce viable crops for a few seasons, and then they have to move on to another area of the forest and burn that down. So this is one of the major contributors to the depletion of the tropical rainforests globally. Subsistence agriculture generally involves a polyculture, which is a system of growing many different plant species in the same plot of land. There's also intensive subsistence agriculture, which basically involves a lot of labor, such as human labor here, pictured at the top. And here's a second picture here showing this is a good example of the terracing that we've talked about to control soil erosion. But often, because no heavy equipment can be used to collect the rice, there's a lot of human agriculture or human labor involved in rice paddy collection of the harvest and so forth. Now, commercial agriculture or mechanized agriculture is what we often think about here in the United States, a more developed country. This really is producing crops for profit, where a few individuals are producing food and selling it to market or individuals in the community, or even exporting it to other countries. Often, commercialized agriculture involves using, rather than polycultures, monocultures. So it's a system where you're only growing one single cash crop. And so you can see based on this that the biodiversity and species richness of these fields is very minimal. So there's a huge loss of genetic diversity associated with this. There's a high reliance on fossil fuels, fertilizer, and pesticides. Now, industrialized agriculture was an important revolution, an important development in what we call the Green Revolution. And this is a period where technology advanced to the point where we could increase crop yields. This is why we never saw the Malthusian catastrophe, because we could now grow more food on the available land, something that Thomas Malthus did not include in his hypothesis. So we can see this graphic will look very similar to the Malthusian hypothesis that I showed you on the first slide. So basically this is the flat line that is representing land availability for harvest. So this blue line is the area harvested in millions of hectares. And so basically we can see since the 1960s it's pretty much flat, maybe even has decreased a little bit, meaning we haven't created more land to farm on, which is what Thomas Malthus had proposed. Like, we can't just make more farmland. We only have what's available to us. Well, we saw over time that since the 1960s, since the invention of commercial agriculture and industrialized agriculture, production increased. This is what was known as the Green Revolution. Now, take a moment to make sure you understand this Green Revolution is not talking about the green movement we see with being environmentally sustainable, right? When someone says I'm going green, they're usually trying to be more conscientious of the environment. This is not what we're talking about. This is taking a look at how more food was able to be produced on the same amount of land. So we can see this orange line here is looking at the production of crops, and we can see all the way up to like through the 80s we saw a steady increase, a little bit of a flat line in the 80s and 90s, and then there was a second green revolution 2.0 they call it, or sometimes referred to as the gene revolution, where now we could produce even more crops with genetically modified crops, GMOs, that could produce a higher yield. So the idea here is that technology and science has helped farmers and agriculturalists to develop more food on the same amount of land. And this is why we have not had this Malthusian catastrophe or collapse of the human population because of not having enough food. We have plenty of food. What we see now is the concern from agriculture is all the impacts of using these technologies on our environment. So interestingly though, we did mention that there is plenty of food, but so we really should be experiencing a food security where people always have enough food to supply the caloric needs day in and day out. We should be sustainable with the amount of food we produce. However, we see that there is an awful lot of food insecurity still in less developed lands. You can probably see that from this map here. The areas of South America, Africa, and Southeast Asia experience various times of food insecurity. What's interesting about the causes of these is it's not a lack of physical food on the planet. It's usually some sort of political or environmental concern that is producing this concern. So we see Haiti, a lot of deforestation. We talked about that in our forestry lecture, right? And so therefore natural disasters and deforestation are leading to extreme food insecurity in Haiti. We can see Burundi was affected by civil war in the early 2000s. Kenya, ongoing drought as a response to climate change and poor governmental response. Here we can see Pakistan, poor economic situations resulting from bad government, basically poorly executed policies to bring or led to food insecurity. We can see also in Mongolia, basically when we see the dissolving of the Soviet Union led to conditions of strife in Mongolia, along with the very harsh winters and dry summers that are now more common in this area because of climate change. So the point here is we are developing plenty of food because of modern agriculture. Food insecurity is usually a product of political instability, poor economics, and climate change bringing extreme weather conditions. Let's now talk about some of the concerns that the Green Revolution introduced environmentally. So one is the use of fertilizers. Fertilizers, of course, are used to ramp up the NPK. You may remember that from your soil lab, the amount of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium that's in the soil. So these can dramatically increase crop yields, so they're very beneficial in that way. However, we can become dependent on them, and they have several environmental consequences. For example, we have excessive water pollution. When we put too many fertilizers in our soil, well, when it rains, any fertilizer that is not taken up by the plants washes or is traveled or carried away by the runoff, the rainwater that doesn't seep into the soil but runs off into waterways. And when those excessive fertilizers end up in ponds, lakes, etc., they accumulate and do what they're supposed to do. If they're supposed to stimulate plant growth, well, they stimulate algal growth, or the growth of algae, and can lead to what we call cultural eutrophication. Now, we're going to focus specifically on this type of pollution later when we look at water pollution. We see climate change is also a concern because a lot of the fertilizers release nitrogen oxides, and those are potent greenhouse gases. We also see soil degradation. Synthetic fertilizers especially deplete the soil of its important microorganisms and alter the soil chemistry. Pesticides are also a concern. These are used to control or kill pests. So when we're growing a certain crop, there might be an insect that is attracted to it that consumes on it. Now, there's many different types of pests and pesticides. So insecticides are probably what we think of most commonly when we refer to pesticides. These would kill off any nuisance insects that are consuming their crops. Fungicides will take care of blight and fungal blight that basically is killing the plants. Herbicides would get rid of weeds, and rodenticides would get rid of rodents that are coming in to consume what's growing in our gardens and crop areas. So there are two general types of pesticides, or categories, I should say, not types. So broad spectrum pesticides are designed to eliminate a wide range of pests, whereas narrow spectrum pesticides are designed to be more specific, and they're only targeting a specific organism. We tend to say that narrow spectrum are better for the environment because if you're trying to kill off just one type of insect, you're not also killing off the beneficial insects. Pesticides often tend to be very persistent. So they have a lot of organochlorine compounds in them. These are very stable compounds and do not biodegrade over time. So that means they persist in the environment for a long time. They are often fat soluble, meaning they will accumulate in the fatty tissues of organisms. And as such, we have an important term to understand here known as bioaccumulation. This is the buildup of pesticides, or really any, this can happen with heavy metals and other pollutants that are put out into the environment, where they accumulate in the tissues of living things. And we can see that here in the plants and phytoplankton. In this diagram here, we can see that the salt marsh and bay numbers, this is looking at DDT, a now banned type of pesticide, and we can see that there is measurable amounts of DDT in these tissues, even though DDT was banned years ago, but it's still showing up. And what's interesting, if we zoom in here on or if you take a closer look here at the marsh plants, notice the shoots or the leaves and the stems have a much lower amount of DDT than the roots. Well, the roots are in the soil, they are absorbing nutrients and such from the soil. Well, as a consequence of that, they're also bioaccumulating more of the toxin, this DDT, in their root system. Now, another consequence of persistent pesticides is what we call biomagnification. This is where we see the concentration of the pollutant, in this case the DDT, accumulates and magnifies as you go up the food chain. So we look here at the osprey, for example, has a much higher level of DDT at 13.8 than the grass did. Cormorants are at 26.4, so one of the highest in this diagram. Well, why does that happen? Well, if we look at the cormorant, when a cormorant is eating, it doesn't eat just one eel or one flounder or fluke here. It eats several during its lifetime. And every time it eats one of these prey items, it gets a dose of DDT that it then stores in its own fatty tissues. And so that accumulates and magnifies over time. So DDT was one of the reasons the bald eagle was struggling for so many years and was listed on the endangered species list. And because of that protection and the banning of DDT, the bald eagle is no longer endangered and has made a nice recovery. But pesticides, we can see here, are a problem because of the amount of accumulation and magnification that occurs within the food web. We also have a concern with what's called pesticide resistance, which is where a pest population starts to become less sensitive to the pesticide. This is basically an application of natural selection. So there's basically selective pressure from pesticides. And what we mean by that is if we apply an initial spray of pesticides onto a crop, we will see that the individuals that are susceptible to the chemical that's in the pesticide will die off. But as we have come to understand, there's often a natural resistance. Some organisms have the genetic combination and fitness to not die from the pesticide exposure. So over several generations, we see that there are some pesticides and some insects that just become resistant to the pesticide. So our response is often to add more and more pesticide with very little effect. And oftentimes we are killing off the beneficial insects that would naturally control the pests on their own. And so and this is especially true when we're using broad spectrum pesticides. Not only do they get rid of the pest problem, but they also get rid of the beneficial insects, and our biodiversity in the area goes down as a result of this. This is not just with insecticides, but here's an herbicide, a very popular one, glyphosate, which is a common ingredient in Roundup. Notice how the glyphosate use has increased quite a bit since the 90s. Along with that, since the 2000s, we have seen a likewise increase in the number of weeds that are resistant to that glyphosate herbicide. And so what this does is it creates resistance, and it's harder to get rid of these weeds. And the response has been to put more glyphosate into our environment. And now we're starting to see that this pesticide has detrimental effects to human health, not to mention the health of ecosystems as well. Here's another interesting example of how pesticide resistance would work. This is looking at a common insecticide. I believe it is pronounced cyfluthrin, which is used to kill off house flies. So it is a specific pesticide to get rid of flies. And this is looking at house flies in a normal population. So notice when they are given a dose of this cyfluthrin, 0% of the flies survive. So it's a very effective chemical insecticide in this case. However, in poultry facilities like chicken farms, turkey, uh, processing plants, there's a lot of flies. And so they use the cyfluth. I hope I'm saying that cyfluthrin. They use it more regularly. And so notice, because they use it so regularly, the flies have built up a resistance. And so notice a normal dose that killed the normal house flies that would be, say, in your house or my house. Well, it didn't kill any of the flies. There was 100% survival. 10 times, they multiplied the dose by 10 times, 90% survived. Then they multiplied the dose of the insecticide 100 times to 830 nanograms per cubic centimeter. And there's still 38% survival in the flies. Why? Well, because these flies that survived had the genetic combination to be resistant to that pesticide. So they just weren't dying. And what basically is happening here is the use of the insecticide was playing a role of selecting those flies that are more fit for survival. And all we've been doing is, with the chronic use of pesticides, is basically making more pest-resistant populations. So what are the alternatives? So we discussed the concerns with pesticides and fertilizers. So what are the alternatives? Well, we have organic farming, which is, of course, the idea of avoiding the use of chemicals, specifically fertilizers and pesticides, in food production. There's also sustainable agriculture, which is going to integrate not only using fewer chemicals, but more ecological principles into the idea of farming to reintroduce natural biodiversity. So one interesting example of this is agroecology. Here's what it might look like. This is looking at an area where we would have a rice paddy where they're growing rice. So we can see we've planted rice paddies. Then we've introduced ducks because they naturally control the weeds. There's no need for an herbicide here. They eat the weeds, and they provide fertilizer whenever they release their nitrogenous wastes. Well, then we introduce catfish, which enhance that effect, right? They also consume algae, especially stuff along the bottom of the rice paddy sediment bed, and provide more fertilizer for the ever-growing rice. And then azolla is then added. Basically, this is another type of plant. This adds nitrogen, right? So this adds more nitrogen to the soil. So basically, notice we have a nice ecosystem growing here. And so the integrated system is more like an ecosystem, not a cash crop field or just simply a monoculture. And notice what can be harvested is rice, eggs from the ducks, the duck itself, and fish. So you get a higher yield of a more diverse crop. And so this is known as agroecology. We see this also done in the United States, where now it's becoming common to have cows and cattle graze in areas where there's crop trees, right? So there's grass for them to eat, but there's also trees which help to enhance the soil quality, but you can grow fruit on those trees, apple trees, for example. Precision agriculture is another way to take a look at or to become more sustainable. It's still industrialized agriculture, but it uses technology and geographic information systems to basically analyze the field so we're not putting too many pesticides down. So basically, a modern day industrialized farmer, the first thing they'll do in the day is to download the data from their fields, and they may get a scan like this. So they'll see, like, here's their moisture content, and they'll see that really it's just the southwest corner of their field that's a little dry, so they may only irrigate there. So that conserves water resources. Here we can see in this scan of nitrogen in the field. Well, it's only the east side that seems to be low on the nitrogen. So we're not going to put more nitrogen fertilizer on the whole field, just in the areas where it might be needed. So the point of this is to increase crop yield and decrease the amount of chemicals that we're putting into the field. This can also, in the long run, save money because fertilizer and water usage is expensive for farmers. So it decreases the overhead or money that they have to put into growing the food. To help with pesticides, we have an approach known as the Integrated Pest Management System, or IPM. This is a sustainable ecosystem-based strategy to getting or reducing pests. The goal is not to eliminate pests as you would with pesticides. It's to bring them down to a level that is manageable. You're still making money on your crops, but some of them might be consumed by a few pests. So we're not going to rely on broad spectrum pesticides like glyphosate or anything like that. And we use a variety of techniques. Let's take a look. And so we've got, this is a diagram that'll kind of show you the control measures. So you'll notice we've got like basically 4 overlying principles here. We want to prevent pests, avoid them, monitor them, and suppress them. Notice there's no elimination. So the first step here is often considered to be a cultural change, meaning farmers would have to alter what they're growing in their fields, right? They may use a crop rotation in this case. Then the second to avoid, we have physical boundaries, where you might prune your trees a certain way. You may add mulch, you may add traps to physically trap the pests, or you may even cover your fruit trees with netting so that pests can't get to them. Then there's biological. This biological measure basically introduces natural predators to control pests, right? If there's a certain insect that is eating your crop, well, then you introduce the predator that eats the insect and can help control it. The last resort is, of course, to apply a targeted, safe dose of pesticide. And they tend to be selective and non-persistent, meaning they do break down. So we have a couple of examples here. So this is showing you a crop rotation or strip cropping, where basically notice the biodiversity in this field is increased to 2. And by doing that, you decrease the number of pesticides that can attack a specific crop. You might be introducing more diverse array of pests, but those pests would control each other. So if it was just wheat that was growing in this field, well, you'd only have wheat pests and nothing to control them. By having alternate rows of crops here, you may have the pest that is going after these soybeans, for example, may actually help to control the pests that are going after the wheat. Here we can see an example of mechanical barriers, a very fine mesh netting covering the plants, protecting them from predator insects that want to get into them, or even rodents that may be trying to climb up and eat them. Ladybugs are a great example of biological control measure because these are voracious predators of aphids, which are a common pest that we see on crops. So ladybugs, or ladybird beetle as they're called in Europe, these things are very effective at controlling pests in a garden. And lastly, we see the application of a selective pesticide that is biodegradable. Now you may say that this looks very concerning because these individuals are wearing gas masks and stuff. Well, the reason for that is the application of the pesticide itself is very potent. When it's being applied, it's concerning. And so the individuals that are applying the pesticide need to protect themselves, especially their respiratory systems. But because it's a biodegradable pesticide, it breaks down over time. It gets rid of the pests temporarily so the crops can grow, but then it biodegrades over time, and by the time it's harvested, the amount of pesticide is minimal if completely absent. Here is an example of looking at, again, ladybugs and insect predators. And as I mentioned in the previous slide, the goal of IPM is not to eliminate all the pests, but to bring them down to an economic threshold. So you can see that in this graph here. Right here we had pest density was really high in the 80s and 90s in this example. There's an introduction of ladybug predators. and that drove the pest population not down to zero, but to a manageable threshold. There were still pests, but you could still grow your crops without them being completely devastated by the pests. Interestingly, in 1947, when we started to use a lot of DDT, we saw the pests recover because the DDT was a non-selective pesticide that was killing the ladybugs. And so when DDT was again banned, then the pests went back below that economic threshold. Some additional alternatives to conventional agriculture would be the genetic modification of crops. So this is basically GMOs are crops that have their DNA altered for specific desirable traits. And so there are many benefits to GM crops. They tend to get a bad name, but let's talk about some of their benefits. First of all, is the idea of a GM crop is to reduce pesticide use. This is looking at the use of a particular GM crop known as Bt corn. Bt stands for Bacillus thuringiensis, which is a bacteria that has a toxin that is not liked by the European corn borer, which is the main pest to corn populations. So what scientists did is they took the gene for that toxin that that bacteria produces, which doesn't hurt humans at all, but is just not good for the pest that wants to eat the corn. They spliced that into corn, so the corn will grow with natural levels of this Bt toxin in them, and so it wards off the pests. So notice by doing that, the corn plant itself can defend itself from the European corn pest, the insects that want to eat it. And so as a result of that, when we increase the amount of using that genetically modified corn, our use of pesticides, specifically insecticide, has gone down likewise. It's an inverse relationship. So the idea of using GM crops is to reduce the amount of harmful chemical pesticides we have to use. This can also increase crop yields. We talked about that with the gene revolution, or the second phase of the green revolution. This can improve farmer profits because they're losing fewer pests. They're not losing as many crops to pests, and also they don't have to water as much. We can see that some can use a lot of these genetically modified plants don't require as much water. We also have enhanced nutritional content. This is looking at golden rice, which is basically where they spliced in a gene for beta carotene into rice. The reason this was brought out is because many children in less developed countries have a vitamin A deficiency, which leads to childhood blindness. Well, in humans, beta carotene, which you find in carrots and sweet potatoes, is a main component that can be used to synthesize vitamin A. And the reason they targeted rice is because many of the children in less developed countries, a lot of those areas can grow rice very easily. So the idea here is, well, let's go ahead and put beta carotene in the rice. It's a cheap crop to grow in these less developed countries, and this would help children get beta carotene in their diet so they can synthesize vitamin A and have decreased the incidence of childhood blindness. And as mentioned, some of these crops, these GM crops, require less water, so that makes them more resilient against drought and heat, which is important when we look at climate change. This also can reduce food waste as well. Now, what are the concerns? Well, there's a lot of concern about what are the long-term effects on the human body. We don't fully understand yet because we haven't been using them for many decades. So there is ongoing research to see if there's any long-term effects. So far, the research has shown that they are safe. There haven't really been any concerns with human diets having GM crops. There is maybe some concern about allergens, but so far it hasn't really, nothing ultimately alarming has surfaced in the peer-reviewed literature. You might find stuff online in blogs and stuff like that, but the peer-reviewed scientific literature seems to show that they're fairly safe. The major concern is that genetically modified crops have overall impact on biodiversity. the, by their design, they have low genetic diversity, and and that can affect ecosystems. This also would require farmers to invest in seeds every year. They can't grow their own GM seeds because they don't have the technology, so that could lead to some economic stress for certain farmers. One of the best alternatives to agriculture, or strategies to help with many of the problems we looked at with agriculture, is consumer choice. So a growing number of consumers are concerned about their footprint. And so basically you have a choice to buy certain types of crops. And so this is where a lot of individuals are trying to purchase organic crops and also buy locally. Here's an interesting graphic showing you the clean 15. These are the things that have the lowest pesticide residues. So things like onions and sweet corn tend not to have many pesticide residues. So when you're purchasing them, you probably don't have to worry about getting these as organic, because they're just not going to have, like avocados just won't have many pesticide residues. So don't get organic avocados, just you can purchase the regular if you're concerned about your health. The dirty dozen are those with the most pesticide residues. So apples, lettuce, these are the things you may want to go ahead and get. If you're concerned about pesticide residues in your diet, you might want to buy organic apples rather than regular apples, because the organic apples will not have the pesticide residues. Let's now take a few minutes to discuss meat consumption. So this is a form of agriculture. It's not growing plants, but it's growing animals for consumption. So global meat consumption has been trending upward for some time, especially in developing countries. And the reason for that, and we can see if we look at this graphic, yes, from the 1960s, our production of meat has been increasing as a whole globally. You can see the biggest increase is in the area of Asia. Asia, which includes China and India, have gone through a tremendous amount of industrialization. And so as such, excuse me, when a country becomes industrialized, they tend to switch their diet from being primarily plant-based to one having more animal proteins. And we can see that, notice most of the developed world has a much higher per capita meat consumption than areas that are less developed or are developing. No surprise that the United States continues to consume the most amount of meat globally. So high meat consumption in this developed country. And it's kind of leveled off though in recent decades, and we'll show that here. So there's been a shift from red meat to poultry. So basically, there's a couple of reasons for this. Is that there's health concerns with eating red meat, and poultry has less of those concerns. Also, poultry is cheaper. It's easier to grow, and that keeps costs down. We've been seeing locally in the last decade or so, the prices of beef have really skyrocketed, whereas pork and poultry have not. So they're becoming more favored. Also, we see younger generations like millennials and Gen Z are more open to the idea of vegetarianism or going vegan or flexitarian, where basically they're not going to base their meat or diets solely on meat, but are open to other areas of protein alternatives. There are benefits and drawbacks to meat production. So one of the major drawbacks, one of the major issues with meat production is concentrated animal feeding operations, CAFOs. And these basically are very overcrowded areas where basically we're looking at cows here and chickens that are fed grain instead of grass. And the idea is just, it's like an animal factory, just to kind of produce as much meat as possible. They generate a lot of organic waste, which can contaminate the ground, and also cause a lot of water pollution. But the reason they're used is because they're less expensive and you can get more meat per acre. And this keeps costs down for consumers, right? So that is where we would see that would drive prices down, but there's a high environmental impact, and also the ethical treatment of these animals is under consideration too. In contrast to that is free range grazing, which allows animals to feed on pasture land, to be actually out grazing on true grass for their entire life cycle. It tends to be free of antibiotics. These animals aren't in close quarters where disease is a problem, and a lot of concentrated animal feedlots have an issue with diseases, and so therefore they have to use antibiotics and other chemicals to prevent the spread of disease. Whereas free range grazing, you don't have that problem. The organic waste is not a pollutant, but actually acts as a fertilizer to grow more grass that in turn feeds the animals. It does require a lot of land, and it tends to be more expensive, right, as a result. So if you go to the store and you see organic or free range meat, it's going to have a higher price tag. But what you're paying for is a better quality product and a better environment. Meat production is just less efficient. Whether you're using a concentrated animal feedlot or free range grazing, it's a less efficient production of food. And this is primarily due to the fact that of the 10% rule, that ecosystem energy transfer and the transfer of biomass up the food chain is very inefficient, right? 90% of it is lost as heat or entropy, and only 10% of the energy and biomass goes from producers to consumers. So an interesting graphic here is if humans act as primary consumers, or if humans eat as vegetarians, notice the same one cornfield can support many humans, right? That's what this graphic is showing here. But when we eat meat, we'll see that same area of corn that would have supported, like, what is this, 10 humans, can only support one. The reason for that is because only 10% of the energy and biomass that's in the corn is going to be incorporated into the cows that are eating it. And then only 10% of the biomass and energy in the cows goes into supporting that meat eater. So it takes, because of this factor, it takes a lot more land, water, and energy to produce the same number of calories from meat as it does from plants. So this is why eating less meat in your diet reduces your carbon footprint and your ecological footprint quite a bit. Interesting graphic here to show you the production of a pound of meat. So for example, milk, a pound of milk requires 1.1 pounds of feed. Eggs requires 4 pounds of grain or seeds for the chickens to eat. The chicken itself requires 3 pounds of feed, right? So interestingly, the eggs require a lot of input. Pork, 7 pounds. Beef is 6 to 10 pounds of feed. So notice for every pound, rather than getting, so if you look at beef, for example, you could, if you could be given 6 pounds of grain, you can use this to make bread and other things to consume, or you could trade then for just 1 pound of beef, right? That's what we're kind of talking about here. So there's a loss of biomass and energy when you get from this stage to the vegetable, the grain, to the meat. So it's just not as efficient. So we're not saying to eliminate beef and such from your diet, or chicken and pork, but maybe there's some consideration that, well, if you eat less of it, that's less of an impact on the environment and is probably better for your health as well. We also see concerns with overgrazing. Too many animals feed on a particular area. We talked a little bit about this with the tragedy of the commons, right? So if we're trying to have too many cattle in a field, this can lead to soil erosion, right? This can even lead to desertification, where areas are so overgrazed that the plants can't grow back and the soil composition degrades and it becomes a desert. There's a large carbon footprint that is associated with meat. So if we look at the carbon footprint which is basically looking at the number of greenhouse gases that are produced in this graphic. We can see a tomato produces 1.1 kilograms of carbon for every kilogram it's produced. So it's pretty much neutral. We see that tofu is pretty low, wheat, potatoes. Your plants have a very minimal carbon footprint. But when we get to the meat, we can see pork. For every pound of pork or kilogram of pork produced, 12.1 kilograms of carbon dioxide are released into the atmosphere. Beef is much higher, and the highest meat with carbon footprint is actually lamb. This is why reducing your carbon footprint comes with becoming more vegetarian or eating more pork or chicken. Why is this a big issue when it comes to climate change? Well, what's interesting, when we look at the greenhouse gas emissions, 74% come from the transportation sector and all industry and stuff. 26%, or a quarter of all the greenhouse gas emissions that are driving climate change, come from our food. And when we break that down, over half of that is from animal products. So again, if you switch to more vegetables in your diet, you reduce this, right? And when we break that down, we can see a lot of the carbon is coming from beef or lamb. So if you're not going to give up meat, well then perhaps eating less beef and lamb and more fish and poultry can also help with this, right? So we're not calling on everyone to be vegetarians, just the idea that, well, maybe what meat you eat and how much you eat can go a long way to helping. Sustainable meat production is the idea of minimizing this environmental impact. And so one of the most important ways to do this is what we call rotational grazing. So you can see here in this field that the ranchers will basically move the herd, it's that they're growing here, to different pasture lands. So you're giving each quadrant or portion of the field a chance to regrow. You're not overgrazing, and this is very helpful. This also conserves water resources and helps to prevent release of greenhouse gases. But one of the biggest drivers in sustainable meat production is consumer support. So if all of us, and I've said this a couple of times, if we reduce our overall meat consumption, that goes a long way. Interesting graphic here, if everyone on Monday just went without meat, just for one day out of the week, notice it would save 1.5 million gallons of water. It would be equivalent to basically driving 352,000 less miles globally. So fewer cars on the road is kind of the equivalent. And it would eliminate 5 tons of carbon dioxide emissions every year in addition to the health benefits. And that's just one day. So it's an interesting concept. Also, when you're choosing your meat, look for certified meat that is organic, grass-fed, free range. Be aware of the difference between cage-free and free range, right? So cage-free can still be a concentrated animal feedlot. You see that with chickens and eggs. Free range is going to be a better selection. Also, choose meat that is locally sourced. Go to a farmer's market or go to a local butcher shop that gets their meat from local farmers, because that travels fewer miles and is more has fewer carbon emissions as a result of that. All right, let's finish up with some AP practice here. So which of the following is a disadvantage associated with the genetic modification of crops? And you look at those choices. The correct answer here is C. Genetic modifications can decrease the genetic diversity of crop species. Here is your FRQ. Go ahead and pause and you can answer this question here, and I'll show you the correct answers. So the correct answer for A, notice we were to calculate, this is a 2-point question, so this is calculation. 1 point for each year, right? In 1950, basically you should have gotten 20 kilograms of meat per capita or per person, whereas in 2040. Then you use those answers to get the percent change in part B, so also 2 points to correctly calculate the percent change. So it's a 100% increase or 200% higher than the 1950 value. You basically could have given that in either way. In part C, you're basically going to look at a comparison between grain production and meat production. So you can see here, look at the difference in land use, that would be worth 1 point, and energy use. So I'll let you read those over and see what the correct answer is. In part D, also worth 2 points, you were basically to identify a problem and the environmental consequence. So overgrazing on land leads to desertification would have been a great answer for the part D. Part E, you're to look at the advantages and disadvantages of switching to a more vegetable-based diet. So advantages could be health-related, right? So consuming less meat can reduce the risk of heart disease, for example. Disadvantage is that meat is a high protein diet, so you could have protein deficiencies here.